Well, good morning, good day, good evening, good late night for some of you. It's so wonderful that you are joining us for this second event of the series called Narrating Urban Lives, which the Global Urban History Project has spearheaded with a bunch of our collaborators, who I'll name and thank in just a moment. This is the second event called Archival Futures, which is curated by Anwesha Ghosh, who will be our primary host for the day. I'm Carl Nightingale. I welcome all of you to this really very, very interesting event with incredibly interesting presenters. I just want to say a little bit about the series quickly and thank our collaborators on this series. First of all, the Narrating Urban Lives comes out of a series of conversations that we call dream conversations that first got started when we were all cooped up because of the pandemic and wanted to talk to each other, and wanted to talk about big issues that face our field of urban history and then also urban studies in general. As time went on, we got more and more collaborators. It is now become, an event that involves many other organizations as well. And I want to thank Kenny Coopers in particular for his support through critical urbanisms at the University of Basel, and for the beautiful posters that he also was able to commission for us through his group. Also, we have a lot of collaboration and worked a lot with the organization UTADU, the African Cities Workshop in Nairobi, the Urban Studies Institute at Antwerp, and the Beyond Inhabitation Lab. And finally, we've also had a lot of publicity help from some of our sister organizations, the International Planning History Society, the Society for American City and Regional Planning History, and the Urban History Association. Thanks to all those, and thanks to you all for joining us. I will pass this over now to Anwesha, who will lead us into the meat of the matter. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Carl. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second event in the Narrating Urban Lives series, where today we shall be discussing archival futures. I'm joined today by speakers who have employed different methodologies beyond the scope of the official archive as a way to rethink the question of the right to the city, the politics of urban land, and water justice. Back in 2023, when I had proposed this panel, I wanted to situate our discussion around archives, which has been central to the historian's craft, to also think of the ways in which the archive has come to imply ways of reading, seeing, noticing, and recovering what is said or sayable and unsaid and unsayable. Our speakers here have also been involved in the work of using a range of conventional and creative tools and technologies, and I use these words very loosely, to create or to use archives that are more publicly legible and accessible. Today's conversation is an invitation for us to think critically about the role of archives and archiving practices in narrating our contemporary histories of what Ritajyoti calls inclusive urbanism. In the order in which they would be speaking, we are joined by Yahia Shawkat, Bhavani Raman, and Ritajyoti Bandyopadhyay. Thanks so much for being here. I would say a little bit about our speakers. Yahia Shawkat is the co-founder and research coordinator of Tooba Research Studio in Cairo. There he edits its Built Environment Observatory, a web portal investigating the commodification and financialization of housing, as well as raising awareness around equitable housing policies and strategies. Yahia authored Egypt's Housing Crisis, The Shaping of Urban Space, which traces a social and statistical history of rental, self-built, and mass housing, and co-edited Nashtari Kulshe, which translates into We Buy Everything, that investigates the commodification of housing and the city. Yahia is also a PhD candidate at TU Berlin. Bhavani Raman is an associate professor at the Department of History, University of Toronto. Her research and teaching focus on the histories of colonialism in India. Her first book, which was Document Raj, Writing and Scribes in Early Colonial South India. She has also published on migration and return in the Bay of Bengal and the history of Tamil studies as an interdisciplinary formation. She is currently working on two projects, one on the history of security laws in the early 19th century India, and the second on the history of hydrological infrastructure in the city of Chennai and its wetlands. Our third speaker, Ritajyoti Bandyopadhyay, teaches history and political economy at the Indian Institute of Science, Education and Research at Mohali, India. He works on the trajectories of capitalist accumulation and urbanization in 20th century Calcutta, economic informality, post-colonial statecraft, and its relationship with knowledge, social policy, rent, and tenancy relations in South Asian cities, and mass political formation under popular sovereignty and neoliberalism. He is the author of Streets in Motion, the making of infrastructure, property, and political culture in 20th century Calcutta. Ritajyoti divides his time between academics and activism and uses one context to ask questions on the other. From time to time, he also contributes political commentaries to mainstream media outlets. At the outset, I had shared with my panelists a little in advance a couple of very broad questions to get us started. Each of our panelists have 8 to 10 minutes time to make their opening statements. The questions that I had proposed before them are as follows. One, how do you think of archives in relation to your work? And the second, what makes your archive urban? So we'll get started with Yahia Shawkat. Take it away.
Well, thank you, Anwesha, for this very lovely introduction. I'll just jump right to it. Where is my presentation? Please let me know if I'm over my time. I'll try and be very short because I think you mean this to be more of a discussion. So yeah, I guess everyone, the first thing that comes to most people's minds when they think of an archive is an image like this. Lots of old documents dusting away somewhere in a basement or someplace. And well, to tell you the truth, I'm not a historian, but thank you very much for inviting me to this and to this cohort. I'm originally an architect, and I practiced for about 10 or 12 years, and then I've shifted my focus to housing rights and researching housing policy. And I've never stepped into an archive like this. Most of my work has depended on digital documents, a lot of them old, relatively old, modern history old. So, for example, someone very industrious found the leading Egyptian newspapers digitized archive from the 60s through the 90s. Online somewhere or through a library that had digitized them, and he or she uploaded them all onto the Internet Archive. This is huge for anyone that knows Egyptian bureaucracy or Egyptian state agencies. If you walk into the newspaper, the Ahram, and ask them to look at the archive, it's very tedious, it's very expensive. To go through their microfilm and to find something that you have to be very specific for what you're looking for, and pay almost by page or booklet. So having this is really priceless as a resource. And I was able to use it for one specific project, which was mapping a major earthquake for Egypt that happened in '92. By reading almost each of the daily editions that came out in the 3 months after the earthquake, and then sort of looking after that because there wasn't a comprehensive report about the earthquake. And for me, this was a very, if not the major urban event to happen in Egypt, Cairo, and its surrounding cities in the 20th century. And there was never really any comprehensive report or study of it. And this really intrigued me. So to find information about it as primary as possible, the newspaper was an ideal candidate. And what I'm showing a screenshot of is each month and almost every day. These are the top sort of as we go these numbers on the horizontal row, and in the column on the side, on the right, are the different sort of categories or topics that I found in each of the editions. So I would sort of jot them down, the page number. Or if for some reason there was a digital, a web-based archive, I put the URL in it so I would be able to find them again, or colleagues of mine working on the project would be able to find the topic or the news article that talked about this certain fact. Sorry. And then this other page shows also how I was sort of extracting the numbers from these news articles as they went, because this was sort of happening. So everything sort of closer to the event itself, to the earthquake, had lower numbers of people made homeless, of deaths, of building damage. And then the more you went away in time, the bigger the numbers became, until they sort of plateaued. So this was also a lot of work trying to find out first the methodology, how to put these together, and then to put them in a way. And this is after it's been cleaned up, so it was much worse before. And then, okay, what am I doing with these numbers? I had something in my head, an idea of how to visualize them. No one's going to look at this and really understand what happened. And what we ended up doing was a map, an interactive map that showed the different Egypt sort of administrative map. And these dots, these circles, the bigger they are, the more destruction or homelessness there was. We did 3 different maps with each with 3 different levels of information. So this is one of the outcomes that sort of shows what kind of archival documents like the newspaper sort of translate and can become a map. Another project I'd like to talk about is my book, Egypt's Housing Crisis, which relied on what I'd like to call policy mapping. So looking at how different policies, housing policies in this case, enacted over almost 8 decades, had an effect on the Egyptian housing landscape. And for this, I used a lot of legislation, a lot of laws that were passed in that time, regulating rent, giving amnesty to informal housing, changing the building codes, and so on. So these laws are very boring to read, very long. It takes a lot of time to sort of find out what you're looking for. And again, the only way I could access them was through digital archives that were digitized and made online of these documents that maybe up until the 2000s were not originally or contemporaneously provided as digital copies. Other information I looked at were presidential speeches or speeches by officials, and these are also been sort of put together since at least the 60s in a more methodological manner. And of course, statistics. A lot of statistics have been made digital or have been digitized from the 60s, 40s till today. One problem is they come like this. So this is an original copy of the census from 1976. So not so long ago, about 3 years before I was born. But you can see it's very hard to read. So the copy or the original that the copy was made from was was really bad shape. And this is from the source. This is from the Census Bureau. So I don't know where else one can go and find maybe a better copy. And imagine putting in numbers of all these cities, and yeah, in this case it was a lot of cities, and finding out what's the accurate sort of number. And so yeah, so then you have to sort of guess a bit or estimate a bit, even when you do have something that is supposed to be the document that shows you the fact. But it ended up well. I was able to map more or less these policies that you see on the column on the left over time, over the decades, different governments and how they viewed housing. So this was an outcome or an idea of how these original documents metamorphosed. Another way was how the statistics again would be shown in graphs and visualized in a way that could be made more legible. So to me, it's like looking at an iceberg. You know, you have the tip of the iceberg. That's what the readers and the viewers get. But beneath it or behind it, there's so much work that's tedious that only someone who really likes that kind of work can do it. And then you have this. Anwesha, how are we doing for time? I might have just another bit, very short bit.
Another minute or so. Yeah,
okay.
You're good. Yeah.
So the third and last sort of manifestation also is, okay, what if now, I mean, since the internet has been around for 30 odd years, originally digital information is now an archive, is now old. We have something called link rot, which is when you click on a link and then you find out the page doesn't exist or the whole web page doesn't exist. And what do you do then? And for me, again, looking at policies and government projects that came out in the last even 20 years, in a lot of cases, it was tedious or coincidental work that got me to find, for example, this is the Ministry of Housing, the Egyptian Ministries of Housing's website. And as you can see today, so from 2018 to now, it has a certain address, which is mhuc.gov.eg. And anyone that would go online today would think that's the only website they've had. If they go into the Internet Archive, again, the Wayback Machine that archives websites from before, you'd go back only to 2018 and you won't find any information before that. So did the ministry not have a website before then? Well, actually it did, but its address was different. And this is very unusual, especially for institutions that have a long lifespan. You usually try and fix your address so you can find information. I don't know exactly why they changed the naming, but they had one name that spanned about 10 years between 2008 and 2018, and there's a very big archive online of these pages and the information that changed over that time, but only if you knew the address. And then by sheer coincidence, I found a third address that actually existed between 2006 and 2008. So sometimes it's not just enough to know the current address and to look at the Wayback Machine. Sometimes you need to dig even more and look for other resources, maybe in this case, paper resources or reports from a certain time period, and to see if they put the web link in the report then, and then you sort of piece it together. So it's just one of those things where it teaches you not to take things for granted. And if you're stuck in something and you think, oh, this is it, this is the end of the line for the information that you're looking for, there's probably there could be a bit more. But yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much, Bhavani.
Thank you. I think I'm going to screen share also. Can you guys see it? Yeah? Okay. So I want to begin by thanking you all for this wonderful opportunity to discuss a project that has become a bit of a project, but it wasn't really intended as a project, so it's a bit sprawling. It has also come out of a lot of collaboration, which you'll see layered out. So a part of this talk is also, I think, trying to work through what that means, what collaboration means, and what its attributes are. Maybe I'll dive in and save some of my questions that I also brought to the table to the to you all, which is like what makes an archive urban. I think really resonated with me. So I began this project actually quite opposite to Yahia. I'm a very conventional historian of colonial India. My bread and butter is revenue archives. The more boring, the better. All passive voice, streams and streams of revenue terms. I had, I suppose, very little experience with actively addressing a public other than, in the traditional form of a newspaper opinion piece or something like that, or as a teacher. And so in 2015, I was confronted by this incredible sense of crisis when the city of Chennai, which is, I live in Toronto and I work here, but that is my home base in many ways, or has been for several years. I spend a lot of time there. Flooded in 2015. So this is almost now 10 years ago. And at that time, the entire city just drowned after a very, very unseasonal heavy monsoon storm. And when the sluice gates of one of the city's main feeder lakes, the reservoirs, were opened without warning. This is, of course, a moment that has repeated itself in Chennai's history, as indeed in many Indian cities since. Flooding is now very much part of the urban experience, the seasonal flood, the disappearing, road and so on. But in 2015, when I landed in Chennai, the entire hydrological management system had collapsed. Sewage and rainwater and river water had swirled into people's homes, marooning people in their apartments. Relief agencies collapsed. The government was at a standstill. And ultimately, it was the fishers of the city of Chennai, it's a coastal city, who plied the boats. And you can see one such image, and who rescued a lot of people stuck in their, fourth or fifth floor apartments. I landed in the city the day after the airport opened. And as we found out, the airport was on a riverbed, and you can see this image from that flood. The city swirled as if it was swirling with the ghosts of lost water that had returned from where they had been banished. And a submerged geography became visible. The area outside my parents' house turned out to be a stream. People were bashing through culverts and city infrastructure to do their own kind of version of draining. And this was kind of ongoing for about a week or 10 days. During that time, what was also interesting was that a lot of civil society groups began to get into action. And one of the things that was produced was the Chennai flood map. It's now on a GitHub repository. You can download it. And it was made by mapping activists and people, open map folks who were interested in getting aid to the right neighborhood. And it was a map that used the phone. People would send their locations, and people would send locations of flood levels, and it would be updated. And it was kept alive for I think almost a year after the flood happened. And this helped an army of volunteers using Twitter and this map to assemble food packets and distribute them. And it was also real data used by state relief agencies. Remember, this is before the whole dashboard system became ubiquitous in urban governance, which is a much more recent phenomenon. The map use, I suddenly noticed. So I was very taken with this map, and I was using this map to find out where, my friends and family were, where they were, because, internet connection was not the best. But what I kind of noticed right after was that map use had in fact exploded along with other issues in the city. For one, this was not the first time the city was in peril, but at the same time, the extreme seasonality of the city had become the extreme seasonality, the kind of water scarcity, water flooding that the city was experiencing on a regular basis began to really enter a certain kind of public consciousness that I hadn't perhaps noticed before, or maybe it was bigger than before. This coincided with a lot of of interventions which are India-wide in terms of refitting the city, retrofitting the city with new hydrological infrastructure, the smart city initiative. I mean, you can keep going on. There's a lot of stuff. So this was has been a decade of great urban intervention, but it has also been a decade of this kind of map explosion. And I want to just share a quick example with you, just so that you get a sense. Hang on one second. Here we go. So I spent some time with an environmental justice collective who then became my collaborators. And this is in 2019 what they began to do. These are fisher groups on the coast who are trying to argue with the government for better services to get their fishing channels, both inland and coastal access, renovated. So they have to they negotiate a lot with the Chennai city infrastructure and governance institutions. And they began, every public hearing began with them actually using maps. And I found there's a whole, and I was introduced to mapping activists who are embedded in these communities, who run these workshops, and who end up sort of showing these maps at these public hearings. So you can see here on the left, the first image is the Veritable Collective's group, the Chennai Resource Center, activists from there going and talking to a local watchman in the salt pans of Ennore, trying to figure out how high the tide moves in that area. The second image is an image from a public hearing where there's a governmental panel showing various kind of water lines in the area of Ennore. And on the right, in that same meeting, you can see the audience, and one of them has a laptop, and they're sort of talking back to these government agencies using their maps. Okay, so basically the point I wanted to make is that there is a kind of an explosion of this kind of map consciousness, shall we say, along with a lot of intervention, and along with, in the context of middle-class Chennai, a nostalgia for water. A kind of a desire to eco-restore its rivers, a desire for clean flowing water, postcards that depict Chennai as the Venice of the East, an anxiety about clean water, a lot of lobbying about the expansion of the total amount of water supply. So these kind of made sort of the context for which I then began to get interested in maps. I was inspired at this point by two wonderful map projects that still strike me as fantastic. One is the Istanbul Urban Database and the Palestine Open Maps, which many of you might be familiar with. They're really worth going and engaging with. And initially, I had thought that the best way to do so, to engage with this project, engage with Mapping Chennai, would be to get historical maps and sort of release them into the public domain and have people interact with them. But as I found, this was not such a simple or straightforward story. And I ran into several questions about how does one share data? How does one keep the data secure? How do you maintain the integrity of the data? Who owns the data? What do you do? Because mapping data, this is also has been a decade when drone mapping has become quite a thing in India. Government agencies using drones, satellite mapping to map and satellite mapping to map property. We're seeing especially the legal system, the High Court, and they're not very map literate. So a very kind of deep investment in the truth telling of maps. And it seemed to me that all this open data would pretty much further entrench and greenwash eviction. This became quite evident. So, the question then was, okay, if you dump this data, who has access to it? It will be people with some access, some means, some interest in making property. And so I found, to answer your question, Anwesha, like what is an urban archive? I found myself reading a lot of South Asian, urbanists and South Asian urban historians with a new eye, because I realized many of their methods and many of their conundrums were in fact at the center of my project as well, very much at the center. So questions of, so basically all those forms of urbanism began to impinge on this map idea and on the archive of maps. So whether it was informality, speculative land value, the thickness of connectivity, the unequal access to information, the unequalness of, infrastructure. So all of those began to impinge upon what I could even consider to be a publicly available urban archive of Chennai. And then finally, the question that became also very apparent to me is, because it's a coastal city, so many of the stories of the city that I was looking into seem to be directly connected to the relationship to its relationship to the sea. And so that made it a little bit different from, say, a typical urban archive, because this then became a subset then of the coastal archive. And so I began to really think about, okay, what do we mean by water? What do we mean? How can one specify a particular kind of archive, urban archive, as related to this vast oceanic space? So terms of, in fact, what am I going to do with this data? I've collected a lot of it and I've begun to analyze it in a collaborative manner. And so the first thing, after a lot of consultation with my friends and local partners in Chennai, we began to sort of think of it as a contingent and evolving set of practices or methods, using mixed media, using a lot of filter, so there is no data dump, there is no transparency, paying attention to methods, trying to pay attention to building literacy through maps, rather than develop tools or run to a kind of tech solution, which I found really very liberating. Because it allowed me to then kind of get back into all the contributions around informality and so on that South Asian urban histories have kind of contributed in the last 20 or 25 years. And I think the final point, and that came back from a lot of discussions and my own sort of field visits, is trying to really understand language that people use in order to talk about the urban form, or even as I got interested, the nature form in the urban form, or the urban form in the nature form. And that left me with this idea of trying to develop maps that embed what we, rather than abstract, to try and embed information back into narrative form. And so I just wanted to share 2 screenshots of, this is during COVID, my group getting together. This is the first map that we developed with a Fisher Elder Espaliam and Vetiver Collective, an environmental justice collective in Chennai. And on the right gives you a little bit about our method. And it sort of shows you, I have a few sentences there that tell you that we had to evolve a protocol around data sharing, around who owns the archive, the custody of this data, who creates the visualization of this archive, who owns the copyright to those images. So we're still sort of finalizing the last bits. But I'm hoping within the next few weeks, we will be able to put it out with a Creative Commons license in Tamil and English. And I'll just leave you with a screenshot of the opening panel of, because I think I've run out of time, an opening panel of the map. It's called Drawing the Language of the Sea. Thank you.
Thanks, Bhavani. Rita?
Okay, so to quickly answer the 2 fundamental questions that Anwesha had raised, I quickly make a move from archives to archiving, underscoring an instituted and institutionalized process of remembering and forgetting. This is the most basic definition that I can think of for this presentation. Any form of institutionalization is an act of inclusion through exclusion. Archiving as an act of institutionalization is no exception to this rule. Here, it's different from other forms of non-institutionalized remembering. What's fundamental to archiving is recording and organized record keeping, which is central to any kind of at least modern sovereign action, be it the action of the state or the action of counter-hegemonic movements. Thus, archiving is an act of politics, power, and resistance. I think Bhavani's first monograph played a significant role in making this a part of historians' common sense in South Asia over the last decade as well. In this context, let me share an anecdote with you. I start with that. It came to me via my teacher, Shomita Sen, through the law of inheritance, I believe. In her inaugural class with a group of MPhil students, the teacher posed the question, what is an archive? A silence filled the room. To clarify, she asked, what thoughts or associations do you have when you think about archives? After a brief pause, one voice cautiously suggested power. Surprised, the teacher delved deeper, asking, how about a library? This time, several voices confidently responded, affirming, power, ma'am, echoing the familiar adage, knowledge is power. Finding the response intriguing, the teacher remarked, don't you typically associate libraries with books? The room fell silent, almost disdainfully so. It seemed too ordinary, too mundane. I could, however, totally relate with those students. The students of our generation encountered the archive in canteens before they entered an actual official state archive. For the teacher, archaeology of knowledge, Anwesha invoked it already, archaeology of knowledge and archive fever came rather late in life. We begin to learn language from our immediate environment. We also begin to learn science by observing natural cycles and rhythms. But we cannot access the past without mediation. It's not immediately accessible. A complex history separates us from, say, the Mughal Empire. Archiving is the selective mobilization of the past for the future. The historian's business is to construct a story out of what's there in the archives. Now, to quickly respond to your second question, Anwesha, I think the cities have some kind of inherent connection with archiving. Why? Two reasons. The first is rather obvious, I would say. Historically, cities have been the administrative centers of both the state and capital. This concentration enabled the cities to house institutional archives. The second reason is that the urban built form seeks to achieve durable materiality along with malleability. Just to give you an example, the early 20th century saw the standardization of paving in Calcutta in favor of asphalt over cement concrete because asphalt ensured both durability and malleability. Durability tends to preserve the traces of the past, while malleability paves the way for an incremental and palimpsestic growth of cities over time. When the historian reads the city as a text, she finds archives in built forms, in planning documents, and in the practices of the city dwellers that shaped and were shaped by the built environment. Footpath hawking was not possible without a planned footpath building in the colonial cities. But the intention of footpath building was a combination of three impulses: creating embankments to protect properties from waterlogging, protecting the subterranean infrastructures, and enabling pedestrian traffic with the least friction with automobiles. The hawkers mobilized this built form and repurposed it for livelihood. The footpath contains traces of both planning and practice and their conflicted coexistence. You can read chapter 5 of my book, in this context. Since I gave it, I didn't want to go back to it. I wanted to just tell you the basic philosophical drive. I must raise another point, which I deem relevant for conceptualizing the contemporary global urban history as also the post-colonial moment in history. To grasp this point, we need to study the history of archiving, at least schematically, in the colonial and post-colonial world. Modern archives in colonial India came into being largely as a legitimacy drive on the part of the colonial state. The usual practice required the government of India to transport shipload of files to the India office in London. The passage to popular sovereignty had significant implications for the archives of the state. The post-colonial rule retained the same bureaucracy, but it was not accountable to the British Parliament anymore. The channels that maintained meticulous paper trails between the colonial and the metropolitan governments became redundant as a result. It is my hypothesis that this eventually led to an overall decline of the official archival procedures in post-colonial India. As far as I can tell from working on my own, a lack of perseverance in building and maintaining government files became apparent from this time on. The source of power and legitimacy of the post-colonial state was not the archives, but democracy. Leaders had to realize this legitimacy of the regime through direct public relations and popular outreach via large-scale mass gatherings. A large part of this public outreach was verbal and unwritten. On the other hand, various social movements that developed in the post-colonial world began to use number, statistical databases, map. For example, both Bhavani and Yahia talked about it. I'm talking about that moment only. Various social movements that developed in the post-colonial world began to use numbers, statistical databases, and archives to stake claim on state resources. In the hands of socially disadvantaged and marginalized groups, record turned out to be a language of social contestation. Ethnic groups, women, and minority groups used numbers and cadastral surveys to make themselves visible, articulate their difference from the mainstream, and to make claims upon the state and its services, leading to the creation and elision of various population categories. In my work on street hawkers, again, chapter 5 of the book, I, for instance, show how by arrogating to itself a certain archival function, which is conventionally associated with the state, sections of the population can become successful in their endless negotiations and tussles with the government. In the context of post-colonial democracy, archives turns out to be a contested field of political negotiation. Thus, in post-colonial decades, the field of archives became diverse and richer, and it expanded beyond the labyrinths of the state bureaucracy. The tactical expansion of the state in popular life during the second half of the 20th century resulted in the democratization of archival practices. In chapter 5 again of my book, I tried to explore some of the implications of this process. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for these very fascinating opening statements, which are all very different, but I'm starting to see some sort of similarity. So I'm going to pull all of those things together. You're right, Bhavani. When I sent out that prompt, I was also hoping that this would generate a longer discussion. And I will jump off from there to sort of ask my next question. And that is, while you all spoke of very different kinds of exercises in your archival explorations, etc., something that became very clear was that Bhavani called it collaborative, and Yahia thanked anonymous contributors on the internet who have fed him with all these different kinds of documents and information. And Ritajyoti talked about democracy. And I was wondering, it's good that Yahia started with the question of, I'm not a historian, so let me just put it out there, because I think where we are trying to go with archival futures is to sort of break the monopoly of the archive, the institutionalized archive as we understand it, as the historian's fort, and sort of try and understand what does it mean to then think about the archive and practices of archiving. Yahia talked about the tedium of sifting through a lot of material and a lot of data, and that there are only a few out there who probably take a lot of interest in sort of sifting through that kind of material. And Bhavani talked different kinds of citizen initiatives which have tried putting together mapping different kinds of urban ecological crises and then putting it up on Twitter and having to work with some of these map making initiatives, etc., and trying to understand the language of that map making exercise, right? And Ritajyoti sort of skirted around the issue, but if you've had a chance to read his chapter, you would have known that he's also sort of identifying what he calls the counter archive, which is not really your institutionalized archive, but the Hawkers Forum have curated and put together this sort of like years and years of documentation. And he quite rightly says that that archive does not await the arrival of the historian. It is not a frozen archive. It is a fluid archive. My question then is that now that we are thinking about this kind of archive as a much more looser term, which is not just about this cold institutional space, and now that we are thinking in terms of collaborations and networks, so that the work of history is no longer a very isolating experience or exercise, what do we do with all of these kinds of things that we are putting together or coming across, right? Whether we are part of the initiative of putting together all of these different kinds of data that the government is not making available to us, or we are perusing these kinds of things, or it is up on Twitter or other kinds of, I would say, democratic digital forums. What do we do with these kinds of data? As a public intellectual, even if we do not want to call ourselves necessarily historians, but as urban practitioners, as public intellectuals, what do we do with all these kinds of data that we feed it back into the system? Are we expecting a certain kind of, Bhavani talked about map literacy. Are we thinking about like, what is the end result of putting it all out there again, right? Or to put it again, very simply, who are we writing all these histories for? All these different kinds of documents and histories. Who is the intended audience of all these kinds of our interventions?
That's a lot, but maybe shall I take a stab?
Yes, please.
Okay. All right. So maybe I'll respond in two ways. That's a very important question you're asking, right? So I read you as asking, okay, what does this actual archival future look like? And I would say that it's taken me a long time to process this project. And what it's teaching me is that first of all, maps are highly sensitive information, by a kind of government of India understandings of its own information. And now increasingly under this new government, data itself, the government data sets that used to be quite reliable or relatively reliable, with digitization, in fact, we're sort of seeing a kind of new fragility come into kind of, things like census and other kinds of statistics, crime statistics and so on. So I think the short answer to it is that no public-facing project that is archivally based, and this is my learning, can be public-facing without responsibly talking about the credibility of data and trying to develop for its own purposes scaffolding to maintain that kind of credibility. So I think that's a kind of a principle by which I think I'm trying to puzzle out what I can do in this kind of very complex data landscape, where there is a kind of a fetishization of data. And, I don't want to undermine the power of the State Archive precisely because it's so secret that information from it has been gathered since the 1990s by RTI activists, but now with the cutting back of the right to information, there is a kind of a question about what can be, extracted from it. So in a way, our work becomes a little more weighted, I would say, even as these kinds of tools are being created for us, as Yahya's project shows, to analyze the data that we retrieve, data sets that we retrieve from the archive. So I think it's like this kind of overall model of secrecy and restriction of access against which we have to sort of think about it. But I don't know. I'm in fact, the double problem for our generation, or this particular decade, not our generation, but this decade of production, is that this data is waiting to be privatized, right? So whether by commercial platforms or by ArcGIS, which I use, or by, other forms of, value making or value harvesting. So I think this kind of the commodification of data and the secrecy of data, these are kind of two pincer-like claws within which I think you find yourself swimming along, swimming against, or trying to figure out what to do. So I would say those are the two challenges.
Yeah, it's a very loaded question. I mean, I think there's two very different types of data that should be defined as such. I mean, there's data that was already publicly available or should be publicly available, and this is like the newspapers, the statistics. This is information that was once public. People could buy the newspapers off the street stands. The census is supposed to be public. So some data sort of gets lost over time, and making it available there's no problem with it. I mean, some archives should be open and should be easily accessible. The problem is when there is private data or data that can be linked to private people or communities or sensitive communities, and that can be misused. This is where a lot of questions need to be asked, and like Bhavani found with the crowdsourcing, with how much data really can you or should you amplify even or make available or easily make available. So I think at the end of this is like looking at these two very different data sets, because when you gather data is different than when you open up data that was already available or already should be public. So these are two different things. Of course, when you gather data, then you really you know what you're gathering. You need to sort of organize it and find out which levels are really private or can be sensitive, and which are more, let's say, macro, or when you average them out, you can't really pinpoint certain people. And this I know from someone that worked on data in France, where you can, as a researcher, buy or access data from the Census Bureau that goes down to like a really small census block. And then they also talked about what they are able by law to make available, and there are rules around this. So yes, there should be rules around the use of data. And again, yes, the privatization of it is also very problematic, because we also work with a Creative Commons license, and we're very aware that there are organizations out there that are just waiting for certain data to be sort of cleaned up or made available, and they have the huge amount of resources where they can just sort of vacuum it up and put it somewhere and add it to other data that they have, and it becomes a commodity that they can sell. or maybe others can use it in even more unscrupulous ways. So, yeah, it is a bit sensitive, but I think in the end, what has always guided me is what is the data really for? So I don't work for the sake of data. Data is not my end target. The end target is the story or the investigation or this something that we're looking at, and then the data sort of scaffolds it or holds it up, but it's not an end in itself. So I think this really has to be, and because I've seen people that are very obsessed with data itself as a raw material, and this can lead to these kinds of problems.
Thank you. I have two things to say. So it is often argued that digitalization of archives makes archives durable, files durable, etc. The problem is, and Bhavani talked about fragility, and that sparked my imagination. So what happens is that with digitalization and complete dependence on internet to access archives, what happens is that internet is completely is a complete monopoly of state and capital, right? So you can have a lockdown of internet, shutdown of internet. So for example, when I cross through Haryana nowadays, there is no internet in train because farmers' protest is going on, right? So internet has been made defunct. So you have state control over internet, massive state control, and one click disables you completely from connecting with people. And also capital. For example, this guy, Elon Musk, can send internet to Ukraine, etc., etc. He can stop it as well, right? So that's what I'm saying, that, of course, a measure of democracy in a country is how freely accessible is its state archives. You can say that. But at the same time, I'm saying that at least due to multiplication of files and preservation of files in various locations in the older archives. For example, if it is not a very rare file, then you will have something in British Library, a copy of it in National Archives. You might find the same in Calcutta, etc., etc. So the file is there somewhere and something can be accessible. But with internet, it is very easy to withhold access. And that's why I am saying that it's a digitalization is a combination of durability and fragility, both at the same time. So I thought I'd say this because when you actually, for example, if you are within a movement that is taking place right now, we have become so dependent on internet to connect with each other. It's very difficult where the data getting leaked, when the state is listening to you, whether my research group has a Pegasus, etc., etc. So that's why I'm saying that I don't know whether digitalization is an uncritical story of durability. It's also fragility simultaneously.
Thanks so much. I wanted to ask a question which is probably going to take us a little away from questions of data and legibility and fragility. But I was also sort of thinking back to the pieces that you've shared with us earlier, and sort of wanted to root two questions around that, which would bring us back to questions of archive and archiving practices. One is that while these stories are coming out of Cairo, Calcutta, and Chennai, I was also sort of trying to root it in a global urban historical conversation, given that we are sitting at GUP and sort of having this conversation. In many ways, one could say that what all of your stories are speaking of are certain kinds of crises, certain kinds of questions of lack, certain kinds of precarity, etc. And that's probably one way of sort of describing Southern urbanisms. And I would love to know how and what you have to say about phenomena called Southern urbanism as such. But I was also thinking, in what ways are these very rooted and very located in Cairo, Chennai, and Calcutta? And in what ways they are also part of a constellation of, radical contingencies? Which is to say, is there a certain way of writing global urban histories which speak about displacements, and which speak about environmental injustices and unfreedoms, and which speak about informality, etc., which is not completely flattened out as a global planetary urbanization kind of a crisis, and retains a certain kind of texture of locatedness, and yet speaks of a certain kind of contingency.
Well, I think one of the main ways that you look at the globalization or making looking at global urbanism is to look at who actually sees it as global, and work your way from there. Because yeah, like you said, informality has sort of been pancaked into one global phenomena, and the other normative being formality, that is this supposedly other global phenomena. And when you actually look at formality, you find that, well, what is formal in one country is different than what is formal in another country. So why is it not the same for informality? And which is also problematic in its sense and in its definition. So it's now we're getting into multiple layers of problematics. But what is interesting is actually looking at, let's say, a global power like the World Bank or the IMF, and look at their policies and how they have really globalized their policies in regards to nations that they call middle income or low income nations, the global south or the third world. And this is where I think is important for peoples of the global south to look, is to look at how these policies that have been exported to them have very similar sources, if not the same source. So for example, I've been looking, or found by coincidence, that the same policy of the mortgage market, for example, on housing in Egypt, is being exported to many different countries around us, in Tunisia, in Yemen, in Jordan. I haven't looked at Southeast Asia, but I'm sure there's some countries there that have been getting some sort of input that is sort of part of one global report about the mortgage market in the global south, and how it can be sort of introduced or formalized, or and so on. So, and then here you see the changes, and of course in their application then you also see the differences, because each one of these sort of packaged applications, when they land in their respective countries, then they're met with the different local forces that resist them, reshape them, and so on. And one of the things that I've seen in a lot of these reports that is common is that, how do these policies not work? Or why are these countries so stubborn not to take on these policies, for example? Or this really makes me laugh at this one-size-fits-all kind of view. So yeah, this is one important thing that that one lens maybe that we can look at and see sort of twist and look at it the other way.
Maybe I'll go next.
Yeah, please.
I think, cities in some senses are, in fact, exactly as you described. They're not isolated from each other, and they're very particular at the same time. And I was just reminded of, Carl's book, which has this great section on Chennai, and, makes this argument really that you shouldn't think of the form of the suburb without thinking of a place like Chennai. And that sort of inserted the city into a, different kind of history of global urbanism, right? So in that sense, I think the research that I do, and I am still working out those connections, I don't think one can talk about the history of, especially a colonial city like Chennai, established precisely to fulfill the purposes of colonial trade and governance. I don't know that you can think about it without connecting it to other cities like, Durban or Colombo or, Bombay or Southeast Asia. And I'm deliberately not comparing it immediately to Indian cities, because I do think its coastal connections might allow us to look at other connections as well that are transnational. Water engineers from Chennai in the early 20th century traveled around. Dev Jani has done some work for Calcutta and similar stories for Chennai. So there's that. But at the same time, what's kind of interesting is, and this goes back to your other question, Anwesha, about, who's your audience? And there are, in that sense, two quite distinct and different audiences, both for city planners and I think for people like myself. On the one hand, in the contemporary world, every city, Chennai certainly is no exception, is trying to kind of create its self-image on the global stage, whether it's through climate change mitigation or being an attractive source of investment, or it's what do they call livability indexes, or there's all that kind of self-branding going on. A whole army of experts are being hired to help with that, right? The PR, the image consultancies, the image makers, the water technology people. There's a lot there. The financing of all of this. And then on the other hand, you have these, I think the real sort of felt crisis of water. And I think that's what made the question for me actually very interesting, this question of water management. Because a city's hydrology, in a sense, in that particular kind of municipal sense, is singular. I mean, portions of it can be modular and you can have networks of same sewage plans and so on and so forth. But there is a particularity that emerges when you look at a city's form at that kind of granular level. And it's, the particularity emerges in the way the monsoon hits the city, or the way in which scarcity affects one part of the city or not, the way in which waste treatment plants are placed next to what canal, who gets to live in the canal, near the canal, and who gets to live in a more high-rise area, who gets displaced. So, particularly who gets displaced, who gets evicted, who gets to be made precarious. So I think in those kinds of questions, there is a kind of particular geography of the city that emerges. And I think maps are an interesting way of making that visible. I found that a very interesting and useful way to do my research.
Okay, so I really have a very small thing to say. I was thinking of the contrary. So the thing is that when we say global history, the default is connection. Can we have global histories of disconnection, for example? Because there are ways in which slums globally are rendered invisible in public discourse, for example, right? So there is a disconnecting experience. For example, I don't think there would be a lot of difference between Gandhinagar and say some other place where state and capital is very strongly present on the streets, right? When Trump came, for example, the entire slums were completely cordoned off so that it is not viewed. Slum cannot be viewed, right? So, we can also have global patterns of disconnection, right? So therefore, the question is, what exactly is global urban history? What is the agenda of global urban history? Is it finding connection, travel of ideas, models, planning ideology from one to the other, and some kind of cosmopolitanism that is emerging out of those travels of ideas? For example, then, colonial period was probably the most connected period in that sense, because, I can see even in late 19th century, Imperial Library had latest copies of Town Planning Review coming to Calcutta regularly, right? So ideas were on the move all the times, even in late 19th century. So, what is that? What is the objective? My point is that, I don't know whether I'm able to articulate, but too much emphasis is given on connection in writing about any amount of global history. Somebody said connected history, then then it became global history. Now it is impossible to publish anything in American Historical Review without a global uh, part in it. So, so is it a comparative history? Is it what it is at the end of the day, right? So I think a lot of deliberation about global urban history itself and its objectives need to be done, because at one level, history as a discipline is organized in a particular way. So, for example, somebody has done social theory and history comes and fractures, shows diversity, shows specificities, right? Now, when we talk about, what should I say? When we talk in global terms, then I see a contradiction between the discipline itself and what is deemed global, right? So some serious thought needs to be given, because what will you do? You need an archive to write a story. Now that archive is located, right? At the best, you can have a comparative history of two cities. But what is global history then?
I think this is a very good place where I should take a pause and open this up so that more of us can jump in and comment and add on. I can already see Carl's hand up. Go ahead, Carl.
Yes, thanks. Thanks for these incredible series of thoughts, and also for the really wonderful short pieces that you sent on that all stimulate a lot of thought for me. On the question of just archives, I'm impressed by how much work you are documenting of historians themselves in creating archives. So it's the amount of scholarly created archive in the presentations you've suggested is a lot. It's almost like it's another whole thing that we need to be doing. We don't just consume archives; we actually produce them. And I'm also interested in how much that can how much the internet and various different platforms and forms allows us then to also make those available so that we don't actually have to travel to some building with a bunch of columns on it or whatever it is and basement that and inhale the dust of the ages while we do our work. So I think that despite the problems that the internet obviously also brings up, that Ritajyoti very, very wisely warns us about, it does feel like the multiplication of these archives and their accessibility should be a priority of global urban historians, precisely because they make so much specificity available to us to decide whether or not what we're looking at is specific or global in the long run. And we can ask questions. I think we have perfect right to ask those kinds of questions of specificity and globality, and we have more tools. The potential for these archival futures is that we have more tools to actually make those kinds of decisions. So that's what I would say right there. But I also want to offer a way. I think I should offer the Global Urban History Project's own newsletter as a vehicle for you to let other people know about these archives. I haven't heard about any of them. Ritajyoti, you have this beautiful set of photographs at the end of your essay that everybody should look at. Everybody should be able to see who does work in any kind of city. Bhavani, the maps, and the archive from Cairo is all of these things could disappear unless we also sort of replicate them. There are lots of ways of putting them up in various different ways that other historians could see that are not under state supervision and so on that I think would be really good. And we in this newsletter we continually put out what we call projects, various different forms of this. And I'll put the Istanbul urban database that's going to go up, the Palestine open map one. We will put those up. And if you have your own private versions of these things, we should put them up as well. We should let people know that they're available. So that's kind of how I, one of the things that I get out of, one of the sources of inspiration I get out of your talks. I appreciate it very much. Any thoughts you have might be, welcome. Thanks.
I'm thinking maybe I want to ask maybe further the provocation that you put out there, right? Between like writing stories or finding stories of disconnection rather than a modular story of connection. And I think that's really valuable. But maybe it's not very well formulated, but I'm just kind of wondering, how would that look, right? Like, what would that look like? And I'm thinking, I'm thinking about your your streetscape. I mean, your book about basically the street, and like thinking about, yes, you see that in a lot of different sort of places. And there is nonetheless a kind of particularity to that lived form, which you're able to document as a historian in a particular place. So I'm curious, I'm just trying to ask you to maybe say more about, what does a history or a project of disconnection look like? I mean, I'm totally on board in the sense that I don't think the object should be to produce a kind of model of a city that then goes traveling. And I think the project of looking at colonial models is precisely to show how that, and people have done this, of course, with water engineers and so on, that shows that it sort of breaks down in a way, right? It's not actually, I mean, that too is a kind of a weird utopian project that you can build canals everywhere and that everything had to move by canals, or that, a connected water system is what defines a good city. So, you can sort of say that, okay, those ideas are also kind of futures past, and a place like Chennai is full of these projects that are futures past. So I'm totally on kind of board with you in the sense that a global form that fits all sizes is, of course, not feasible in the kind of using the methods that, say, a historian tends to use. But then that the other thing is that then how do you build a connected history of disconnection, or a comparative history of disconnection, I guess would be my
so thank you, Bhavani. But so in the morning, I was reading your seminar essay that was circulated, and I have a very. Can I take 5 minutes, Anwesha, to answer this question? Okay, so I have a tendency to draw triads, to conceptualize things. So I was reading your essay along with the inspirational stuff from where it emerged, Lefebvre's Right to the City. And I was keeping both together and I was reading. And I built 3 interconnected triads through the reading of these 2 works. And I am calling it, in a Foucauldian sense, I am calling it a milieu, urban milieu, a site of intervention, right? And I'm saying that these 3 triads are interconnected, but they are in themselves very necessary. Necessary means universal, logical, to be applicable everywhere, right? But their interaction, interdialectical interaction, is completely contingent. Completely contingent. It depends on which organic composition you have taken, right? So I did something and it's there. So what I did was that milieu and then Homo urbanicus, that is the term that Lefebvre used, life in general, and right. These 3 things. So Homo urbanicus is taking inspiration from nature and built form, right? These are the 2 opposites, right? And urban has a particular way to produce nature, to orient nature, built form, right? So it's a co-constitutive existence. Life in general, we all know, production and reproduction. Right, probably, as Lefebvre pointed out, right to leisure and right to livelihood. Right? Right to livelihood. Now, how does one composition of nature divided by built form would interact with production divided by reproduction, or leisure divided by livelihood, or livelihood divided by leisure, social reproduction? That depends on contingent historical situation that your archive enables you to speculate about, talk about, right? So as a Marxist, I have a resolution, and resolution is very simple. That in a dialectic, there would be a necessary opposition and there would be contingent oppositions. So, for example, when in my book I did capitalist urban process, I said that you can polarize capitalist urban process into motion and obstruction. I deliberately didn't call it friction or rest or anything. Motion and obstruction. And motion and obstruction would work anywhere and everywhere. It depends on how you define motion and obstruction, right? But if you go further and polarize motion into consent and force, and obstruction into, enabling motion under subordination and disabling motion under subordination, if you do under the condition of subordination, almost the way Ranajit Ghosh did in Dominance Without Hegemony. So the thing is that then those degrees will differ. Calcutta would be very different story than Bombay's. Bombay will be very different from Madras, and hydrological characteristics of these cities are very, very different. How urbanization happened. So the point that I'm trying to say is that now when I have three dialectics together interacting, that takes you to specificity, that takes you to archive. And the necessary component is applicable anywhere and everywhere. You will have reversals as well. So, for example, during COVID-19, state and capital obstructed people's mobility. But they did it under certain compulsion. That was not part of their ideology. Right? Obstruction, so motion is the ideology of state, capitalist state and capital. Right? So the point that, and obstruction is the domain of human action. That's how I define them. Now, when you do this kind of polarity, then applicability is not in question. So you can have a global history of motion, social production of motion through obstruction, for example. So that's how I resolved myself. I navigated this domain of particularity and globality, right?
Thanks so much, but are there questions or comments, interventions? I mean, I think Ritajyoti has sent out a provocation, which sort of questions then, the basis of weaving a certain kind of global urban history, which is contingent upon discontinuities rather than making it into like a connection.
Exactly, that's my point.
While we mull over that, and feel free to raise your hand, I just wanted to, I had one question from earlier, which I was reserving for later. So I'll just throw that right here to sort of, again, go back to some of the things that you presented with all three speakers. And that is, you all speak of, especially in your works as well, you all speak of a certain kind of materiality to your archive. And I wanted to sort of think about that.
Can you repeat? Your voice got cut.
Am I audible now?
Yeah. It was my internet problem. Can you repeat?
Yes. So I wanted to sort of think about how in all your respective works, you're also sort of discussing the materiality of the archive. There's a certain kind of, we could call it materials, or we could call it things, whether it be rubbles with the earthquake scene in Yahia's Cairo, or it is the question of auto-constructed materials like polythene and plastic and tarpaulin, or we could be looking at just at water. So there is that as one register. And I have a question around that. And on the other side, you have these kinds of very effective registers that you also speak of, like a sense of loss or a sense of frustration. Yahia, while speaking about curation, talked about tedium, or the idea of political resistance or nostalgia. And I was wondering, on the one side, how do we sort of think about the process of materials becoming resources or not being able to become resources, the idea of resourcefulness that you encounter in your archives and in your participant observers, etc., on the one side, and on the other, the question of affective registers. And I was wondering, where do you necessarily start? Say, for example, with Bhavani, is it the idea of the nostalgia that then took you to the question of water and water justice, or was it the other way around? And similarly for all of your works. So I was wondering if we could sort of think about the process between materiality and resource and resourcefulness on the one side, and then think about how do we sort of translate things and objects into affective registers.
Should Bhavani start or Yahya? Who will start?
Maybe Yahya. You've been quiet.
Should I?
Take some
And this is,
mulling
I would
over.
just say, I would just say that this is an invitation to anyone else also to sort of jump in, because the way we've sort of designed this is to also make this interactive and discussion based. And so anyone else who would like to come in and sort of share their works, and if there is materiality in their works as well, and the way that they sort of think about their material archives, and if there is any other a way in which they sort of piece through that archive, are welcome to share those resources as well. Yeah, but go ahead. Yeah, sorry.
No, I mean, I think it's very beautifully put, of the resourcefulness or the resources is because yes, this is what many researchers are after. Where's the resource? Where are the tools? I mean, what are you going to research if you can't find something to research? And in my work, where I rely on, I mean, I can't say I rely equally on data as well as people's spoken experiences or said experience or observed experiences. I think the qualitative and the quantitative are important, and they're always an important intersection. But when I look at policies, I also try and see how they're far-reaching, or how they where they go, whether in time or on an area. I mean, Egypt compared to India is a small country. We're about 100 million people, but for us, we're always spoken to that it's a lot of people, and I've seen this going back as a narrative from at least the 1930s and 40s, where then we were 20 million people. And there was even a complaint then of the rulers then that it's too many people. How are we going to, as government, feed all of these people? Or so the number is always a thing. And for me, is always trying to put numbers into context. So like when the government always talks about billions of pounds in spending, well, it always sounds like a big number, but then you also, when you divide it by the number of people, you find that per capita, for example, it's a very small number in some instances, or too much in other instances. So going back to the resource, which is in this case, I'm talking about numbers. It's it's very tricky. It's not easy because, I mean, some things you don't think are a resource can become a resource. So, for example, like I was looking at legislation up until 2013, and I know the date, probably January 2013. I had almost not read the law before, even though I was trained as an architect, and we design by law, by permits, the building law, and that was the only law I had read to then, and not even the whole law, but just the little bits that we needed to sort of pass the design by, or the architecture by. But in the 10 years, 11 years since, I can't count the number of laws that I've read through, or analyzed. And this is a very surprising resource, because you find not just the sort of the articles themselves, which are very dry and in some ways maybe to the point, in other ways vague, but you also find reports that come with the laws. So reports of the executive agency or ministry that drafted the law, and some reasoning about certain things about it. The parliamentary report of the committee that read the law and analyzed it or discussed it for certain things, or even the parliamentary affidavit of the discussion itself. So other lives happen around the law itself that give you context, and you're able to see things that you're like, okay, they discussed this particular thing. So they discussed building heights, and this particular person from, let's say, a certain either location in Egypt or constituency was against this particular thing, or was for this particular article. So you start pulling a string, and other things come out. And this for me is really interesting, because I don't think anyone teaches it to begin with. So it's a surprise in finding out as you work. And I don't know how many people can benefit from it that would use it in other applications. So I've been using it in urban, let's say, political studies. Where else can it be applied?
Should I, Anwesha? Okay, so very quickly, I take two methodological suggestions of Walter Benjamin very seriously. One is Benjamin said in very many ways that city is a palimpsest. And I talked about it in today's lecture as well. City is a palimpsest, and you have traces of the past. That surface. When you observe, read the city as a text, right? So this is a very significant methodological suggestion, how to think of city itself as an archive, right? Archive of changing sensibilities. So this connects to the question of materiality. For example, you will see a lot of carrying over of the past, that long lost past, in the contemporary practices, in the contemporary architectural form, in the contemporary streets. So that is one that connects to materiality. And second suggestion that also does connect. So in Archives project, there is a famous passage where he says that each epoch can be divided into commonsensical positives and negatives, right? And positive is dead, vilified, backward looking. Negative is dead, vilified, backward looking, suppressed, marginalized. And the positive is living, is ideological, is taken forward, right? So when I desired to write a history of motion, urban motion, social production of motion, obstruction came as a choice, because obstruction has no theory. Motion is the most over-theorized concept. You have generations of physicists talking about motion, right? You have liberal tradition talking about motion. You have Marxist tradition talking about law of motion of capital. There is no dearth of theorization of motion. But obstruction you will find in municipal archives. Municipal archives that deal with, if there is a brick in front of you or pile of sand in front of you, that is obstruction, right? There are so many ways. Hawkers are obstruction. So obstruction is a range I saw in archives. And dealing with materiality of certain forms. And it's a spectrum. So I thought Benjamin's suggestion is very interesting. Take that negative, theorize it, make positive out of negative, and it will completely give you a very different sense of capitalist urban process. It will be a very different history of motion, because it is the contingency of obstruction that makes motion. A global history can be written there. I would say physics wrote the universal history of motion. Motion acquires social life contingency only through obstruction. So Calcutta's motion will be very different from a city of Jabardakal would be very different from, say, a city like Chandigarh, where I reside now. Just the opposite, the way Chandigarh was built, right? So the point is that I think in my archive, I encountered the very material presence of various kinds of obstruction. If you look at Calcutta's municipal laws, the most overused word is obstruction, and there is no theory of obstruction as such, right? So that's what I am saying, that anything out of place is obstruction, right? A pedestrian walking on the street and not on the footpath is an obstruction, right? That's how it works. So how to think about durable obstruction? How to think about counter-hegemonic obstructions? How to think about most banal forms of everyday obstruction? And I don't think that motion and obstruction require any mediation for any urban dweller to comprehend in the first glance. So it is immediately evident. That is the thing, Hegelian method. Marx started with commodity. Why? Immediate, where capitalist mode of production prevails, right? So obstruction and motion are immediate in our urban scene. So I engage with the question of materiality in this sense.
I'll keep my remarks really brief because I'm noticing we're very close to time. And I'll say that was a very beautiful question to ask of us. And I think I would respond by saying that certainly nostalgia, I have become very interested in the work that nostalgia does, especially around water to make property. And what interested me was the parallel between this kind of production of an ordered, watery city in contemporary Chennai, this desire for Chennai to be Venice of the East, premised on like these old colonial 19th century images of the city. And when I started looking into that 19th century archive, realizing, that the production of that Chennai's hydrology was a way of ordering water in order to protect property and create different, regimes of more permanent property holding. So that relationship between those productions of nostalgia, the production of nostalgia and the actual visualization of water flow, water order as a way of governing and creating the city, I found quite fascinating. And this is where the materiality comes in, because there is the liquidity of water and the way in which things like bridges and culverts and embankments become the place from which, or the material form through which water became not just governable, but experienced as governable, right? And in that sense, this became very much a story of matter as well. And the piece that I shared with you all ends up sort of reflecting on this image of water nostalgia and goes back to an 1805 painting, image of a bridge and the production of Chennai as a city of bridges, producing an entirely new imagination of flowing water rather than a kind of a seasonal overflowing terrain of water and land, mix of water and land that would seasonally overflow into each other. So I think that for me was a kind of a way in. But I will also say that subsequently my collaborative research, especially on the wetlands of Ennore, with my collaborator Aditya Ramesh, we were part of a broader collaborative project. We've become quite interested now in, what other forms of past cities still live on in people's memories. And there is an image of Chennai from the 50s and 60s that Aditya and I have been finding in our interviews where, there is an understanding of Chennai's, working people of Chennai having an image of a city that worked for them. And so then that becomes a really interesting question. So, whose nostalgia gets to be represented as nostalgia, or whose nostalgia comes to become representative or iconic of a city's self-image. And not as if the nostalgia that we would, this kind of subterranean nostalgia or the good life that people used to enjoy, it's there, it's ever present. You can tap into it as a person walking around the city, but you have to do a little more work to see it in a representative form of an urban image. So I think Aditya and I have been talking a lot about that, what that means.
Thanks, Bhavani. I think that's a wonderful way of like sort of wrapping up today's discussion. And I'll just end with this. And I think we started with this question of sort of democratizing the archives and sort of thinking about archives and archiving much more broadly. But what we chanced upon is that we're not doing this as a solitary exercise, but we are sort of thinking about it as a sort of consciousness raising sort of urban collective, which is also sort of thinking in terms of communities and not in terms of like neoliberal individuals, competitive individuals. And there's a certain kind of projection into the future and a certain kind of urban future that we would like to inhabit, etc. So it's interesting that so much of your work is also very much in conversation with contemporariness in your cities, because histories are written in the present, even as we think about the past. And the archival tools and technologies help us think about the past in many different ways. So I think this is a conversation that we should carry with us and probably take it elsewhere and continue talking about it. But thanks so very much to all our viewers, our panelists and our organizers for this lovely session. And thank you so much, Carl, for putting this together. We do have the next session next month in April, 11th of April. We have Urban Undersides is the theme, and we hope to see all of you there, and we'll meet there again. Thanks so much for this very stimulating conversation. Thank you.